Hi, I'm Cindy Potter. I'm a physical therapist and the sensory consultant for NHS Allegheny Valley School. Today I'm going to be talking about how we developed the AVS Sensory Development Program and how to use that program. We developed this program in response to a need that wasn't filled in the products that were available to us. We are an agency that works with primarily individuals with severe and profound intellectual and developmental disabilities. We had lots of sensory equipment available. We had multi-sensory rooms and we were well equipped as far as the equipment available to us to provide sensory programs. However, there really wasn't a systematic way of using that equipment or to assess what each individual's sensory processing needs were. So we developed this program because we have many individuals who are nonverbal or their caregivers are not available for information. They may not be able to provide verbal information to us. So this program that's been developed can be used by anyone. It can be used by family members, it could be used by staff, it can be used for any particular diagnosis that an individual might have. We started to develop this to make it easy for people to use. Many of the sensory assessment tools that are out there are based on sensory systems and having some knowledge of the sensory system. We wanted to make it simple for people to use that didn't necessarily have a therapist background or weren't necessarily familiar with the different sensory systems. So the checklist that we came up with is structured around daily activities, which makes it very easy for people to use. Because when we think about how a person functions, we think about how they do when they're dressing or how they do when they're bathing. We don't think about how is their tactile system working or how is their vestibular system working. But we see those things in how they respond to their daily activities. So after much work and research, we put together a checklist that has over 100 checklist items on it. And again, it's structured around daily activities. However, each item on the checklist has been color-coded to correspond to one of the sensory systems. So we know we have 7 sensory systems. We have the 5 senses that we normally think of, plus vestibular and proprioception. So all of those sensory systems, with the exception of taste, are reflected on the checklist items. And we didn't use taste because that gets into some difficulty in evaluating and things like texture and allergies and that sort of thing. So that's not part of the checklist. But the 6 sensory systems otherwise are reflected and have a corresponding color that carries through the checklist and then all the way through to an activities folder that makes it easy for the results of the checklist assessment to be translated into functional activities for that individual. So the checklist itself is a series of yes/no questions, and we look at the items that there are yes responses for as being significant. So it's very easy to use. There isn't a complicated scale. You read the item on the checklist and answer yes or no. From that checklist then, the next step is a worksheet. And the worksheet also lists the 6 sensory systems and then also has 2 columns, one reflecting hyposensitivity and hypersensitivity. Because in any of the sensory systems, individuals can have either an under response or an over response. So we look at the checklist items that have yes responses and circle those items on the worksheet. And then we start to get a visual expression of the trends of where someone may be needing some input to their sensory system. And it will tell us which system and whether they are hypo or hypersensitive in that particular sensory system. Then from that worksheet, those results are translated onto a sensory summary, which is available for the staff or individuals that are working with the person to refer to. So it gives a simple profile that they can look at that again lists those 6 sensory systems, keeping the same color coding, and a check as to where they need some sensory input. So for example, we might have tactile hyposensitivity checked in one column and vestibular hypersensitivity checked. So we know that those are the types of activities that would be most beneficial for that individual to have. So once the sensory summary is available, then you can go to the sensory activities folder, which is part of the sensory development program, and select appropriate activities. The other advantage of having the color coding is that it helps to educate staff and caregivers about the different sensory systems. So the more that they work with the checklist and the worksheet and the summary and the folder activities, they learn themselves about the sensory systems and have a better understanding of how sensory processing needs impact individuals. So let's say the individual's profile shows that they have some needs in the tactile area. Here's the sensory activities folder, which you can easily hang and have available. And tactile in the checklist is blue. So we would go to the blue card and activities. So each of the sensory systems has a card with basic information about that sensory system. So again, it's an education tool for the staff so that people have an understanding of what that sensory system is and how it impacts the individual. So there's a little description about the tactile system. Then on the reverse, it talks about oversensitivity in that area and what you might see, and undersensitivity. So again, staff and people working with the program can gain a better understanding of how over or undersensitivity would impact that individual's function. And then we have a whole series of cards that go along with each of the sensory systems. So this is meant to be a starter point for people. So hopefully when they are using these activities, they'll come up with further adaptations or have other activities on their own that lend themselves readily to programming activities and incorporating sensory throughout that individual's day. So here we have an activity about kneading dough. And what is on the card gives you an objective. The individual will tolerate handling dough without demonstrating anxiety or exhibiting signs of withdrawal. It lists the materials that are needed and the suggested methods to carry out the activity. It also suggests things to observe while that individual is doing the activity. So it makes it easy to record comments about how that individual is doing, and that all gives information so that the individual sensory program can be further developed and further identify what that person's preferences are and what they respond best to. And then it also gives some suggested variations. You know, we're using this program with people that have a variety of levels of cognitive impairment and different types of disabilities. So some of these variations lend themselves to being able to adapt and change each activity to make it appropriate for that person. On the back of the card for each activity, it also talks about how to use it for individuals who have an oversensitivity or an undersensitivity. Because the activities themselves, each activity could be used for people who respond in different ways, and this gives further information about how that would work. So this is a range of tactile activities, and again, for each of the 6 sensory systems, you have the same kind of setup here with the cards. Here's an example of the proprioceptive activities. Proprioception is a very important key sensory system, but it's one that many people aren't familiar with. So again, we have a lot of general ideas about how to incorporate proprioception into the day, an explanation about the importance of that sensory system and what it is. At NHS AVS, we have strongly incorporated the philosophy of a sensory diet throughout all of the programming, and that is really what makes it successful in addressing the sensory needs that an individual might have. If you do sensory programming once a day, that's really not going to make a change in that person's brain or a change in their behavior. But identifying their specific needs using that checklist makes it very easy to incorporate all of the different sensory inputs that that person needs throughout their daily activities. And that really is what makes the program effective. So again, its advantages are many. It's a simple program that anyone can use. It takes about 20 minutes to 30 minutes to complete, and really just needs to be completed by somebody who's very familiar with the individual, because the idea is to reflect that individual's response that they most typically exhibit throughout the day. So not on a bad day or an especially good day, but what is their typical response in answering the checklist questions, yes or no. It's easy to use because of the color coding. That's really a unique feature of this program compared with other assessment tools out there. And again, it's not a standardized test. It is a checklist that helps us to identify trends. So it leads us to where the activities might be most appropriate for the individual. It's available through a variety of vendors, and for more information you can contact Carol Erzin at NHS Human Services.